Someone I want to see.
My friend Sherlock Holmes.
221B Baker Street.
Hello there. Welcome to my review of ITV's The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, Episode 1, A Scandal in Bohemia, starring Jeremy Brett as Sherlock and David Burke as John Watson. This was the third Sherlock Holmes story to be published. The first two, A Study in Scarlet and The Sign of Four, or The Sign of the Four, were novels, so it makes sense to start with the first of the short stories when adapting the series for television. While the series doesn't follow the publication history of the original stories, it does create its own chronology for the stories. So this being the first episode, the next episode takes place after this one, and so on, unless otherwise stated. The writers move dialogue around or adapt it to make that fit. The biggest change this causes is Watson doesn't have the same romantic subplots he does in the original stories. It's a shame, as that would have been nice to see, but these are intended to be episodic rather than serialized, so I can understand that choice. You don't have to watch them in order. The episode opens with the title credits over scenes of Victorian London created for the show, and violin music composed by Patrick Gowers. It immediately sets the scene, letting you know that this is a period piece, set when the stories were set and not updated for modern times. The idea of setting Holmes in the modern age was not something that started with Benedict Cumberbatch's Sherlock. They've been doing it virtually since the first adaptation of the character. Basil Rathbone's legendary take on the role began as a Victorian period piece, but after 2 films this was updated to the 1940s to help reduce production costs, amongst other reasons. Of course now those 1940s films are period pieces themselves, and in some cases look more dated than the Victorian set adaptations. This suffers no such problems, especially if you are lucky enough to watch the Blu-ray versions with their high-definition picture quality. Unfortunately, the Blu-ray set is yet to be released in the UK, but hopefully we'll eventually get it here. The plot is reasonably simple. A former lover of the King of Bohemia, now Czechia or the Czech Republic, has some love letters from the king and a photograph of the two of them together, confirming the letters are authentic. The king wants to engage the services of Sherlock Holmes to retrieve the photograph, as he has made several attempts to do so, but all have failed. He needs the photograph because he has plans to marry a noblewoman, and he's concerned his spurned lover will use the photo to blackmail him or cause a scandal in Bohemia. What you'll notice from that description is that there's no real mystery. There's no murder or even a crime committed, except by Sherlock himself in his efforts to retrieve the letter.
You don't mind breaking the law?
Not in the least.
The only slight mystery is where the woman has hidden the photograph. From here on out we're into spoilers, so if you aren't familiar with the story and don't want it to be spoiled, I would suggest you go and watch it now and come back when you're done. Something else worth noting about this story, especially when you consider that it's the first episode of the series, is that Sherlock Holmes loses. He fails to do what he's been hired to do. The final thing worth noting about this episode is that a lot of what happens occurs in flashback. So we have a story without much of a mystery, where our hero fails, and where very little of the drama unfolds in front of us. Does that mean it's not a good episode? No, not at all, far from it in fact. It just means that the reason the story works is not necessarily for the reasons you might expect. It is a fantastic example of subverting expectation, something many storytellers attempt, although few achieve. The central theme of the episode is how presumptions are often folly. Not only are the main characters caught out because of their preconceived ideas, but so is the audience. We are tipped off to this in the opening scene, in such a way that coming fresh to this story means you're very likely to miss this clue. The episode opens with two men ransacking a house, apparently searching for something. They are interrupted by an older gentleman armed with a club, who they immediately threaten, and so the natural assumption is that the man will be murdered by these two thugs, and the mystery will be why they were there. We are quickly dissuaded of this notion, as the man is soon followed by a younger woman armed with a revolver, who scares the men off. This is a subtle warning to us not to take anything for granted. We're then introduced to Watson, who through voiceover tells us he has been renting rooms with Holmes for some time and he's just returned from being away, setting the scene nicely that this is not their first adventure and the two men are familiar to each other. So when Watson discovers Holmes sitting silently in front of the fireplace, not even acknowledging Watson's presence, and after spotting a syringe in a desk drawer, Watson assumes that Holmes has taken to using morphine or cocaine again. We discover Watson's assumption to be incorrect, and Holmes is actually engaged on a case. The way this scene is shot, and thanks to Watson's incorrect assumptions, it tells us that having a mystery to solve provides Holmes with the same high he gets from drug use, or rather that he can only recapture the same sense he feels when solving the mystery from taking drugs. When he is unable to get that high, that's when he resorts to a chemical one, despite the dangers this might pose to his intellect in his later years.
I cannot tell you how it clarifies and stimulates the mind.
Yes, and destroys it in time.
As much as he values his brain, he would rather burn the candle at both ends than save the flame. As Holmes explains the case to Watson, he gives us one of his more famous lines.
I have no data yet. It is a capital mistake to theorize before one has data.
However, this line will return to haunt him later in the story. The line originally comes from A Study in Scarlet, the first novel, but is beautifully repurposed here, where it perfectly reflects the mistakes characters make. The barely disguised, or at least to Sherlock, King of Bohemia arrives and explains his story of the woman with his photograph, and names her as Irene Adler, a name which barely registers with Holmes, and whom he only has a few lines about in his Index of Notable People. Yet he breaks his own rule and fails to gather sufficient data on Adler, misjudging her completely. He discovers what she's doing as the story goes on and where she has hidden the photograph through use of cunning disguises and a brilliant psychological trick, but he has failed to find out what kind of person she is, despite the fact that he doesn't hold the King of Bohemia in particularly high regard, as evidenced by how he treats him in their initial meeting.
Why should I attempt to conceal it?
Why, indeed?
He still relies on the King's description of Adler as his only source for her character, even when he has the opportunity to discover more by working with her staff. In a quirk of fate, he ends up as the witness to Adler's wedding, and he is clearly taken with the woman, even possibly having a little crush on her. In this episode at least, as we can see by his reaction to listening to her sing. Maybe this clouds his judgments, maybe it's his general dismissive nature towards most women, but more likely he has allowed first impressions from a secondary source to shape his opinion and not seek further information. As the story draws to its conclusion, Holmes plays his big gambit in locating the photo after much research and planning. Disguised as an elderly cleric, with Watson in position, he engineers a fake scuffle to take place outside Adler's house, which results in the poor clergyman getting an injury. Adler brings him inside to recover, where Watson sets off a smoke bomb. In the confusion and potential fire, Adler gives away the location of the photo when she glances towards its hiding place as she contemplates the danger of it being destroyed. This is where we see Holmes's genius at work in this story, although the elaborate setup may have been over-egging the pudding. Here we see Adler go against her own assumptions about the cleric she has welcomed into her home. Clearly, Holmes's performance was convincing, even if his plan was too elaborate not to arouse some suspicion, as she disguises herself and follows the vicar back to Baker Street, using her own ruse to reveal his true identity. It's because of her own intelligence, but also her willingness to challenge her preconceptions, that she is able to outwit Holmes like no other. The story concludes with Holmes, Watson and the King arriving at Adler's home the next morning, but Adler is long gone, leaving a note for Holmes explaining how she was able to beat him and reassuring the King that she will not interrupt his marriage plans, as she has found true love and was only keeping the photo for protection, leaving him with a new photo of just her. It is at this point that Sherlock realises the mistake that he has made. In contrast, the King has learned nothing. He comments,
What a queen she would have made. Is it not a pity she was not on my level?
It never occurs to him that his assumptions about her led to his situation, and it is entirely lost on him when Holmes subtly suggests that Adler is in an entirely different class to him.
From what I have seen of the lady, yes, indeed, she is on a very different level to your Majesty.
It's an enormously satisfying ending, not because Holmes wins, but because he loses, but learns an important lesson. Adler is not dangerous or dastardly. She's intelligent and a survivor, and he recognises that she deserves her victory and her happiness, something she would have never had with the King, who believes himself to be superior because he is royal, something Holmes has no time for. He understands the divine right to rule is propaganda to keep the public deferential to the ruling class, even if the King doesn't. Adler, being an American, means that culturally she probably understands this too, much more than if she'd come from a monarchic society. Irene Adler's impact on Sherlock Holmes stretches far beyond the original stories or character. This is the only story she appears in or is even mentioned in, and yet her impact has such great weight within the story. Watson notes that Holmes refers to her only as the woman, giving her a title that elevates her above all others he meets. He also keeps the sovereign that she paid him to attend the wedding on his watch chain as a constant reminder, and asks the King of Bohemia if he may have her photograph in payment. Later stories and adaptations by others has given her even more importance, but I prefer how this episode handles it, making her someone who Holmes thought a great deal of, and while they hint he was beginning to become enamoured with her, it never goes further than that. She is significant because she outwitted him, and because of how she outwitted him. A warning to him never to be so presumptuous again. She's played beautifully here by Gail Honeycutt, then in her early 40s, the perfect age for the character in my opinion. She plays Adler as clearly wise to the ways of the world, but still retaining the heart of a romantic, and with a hint of innocence, but also a steely determination that makes you believe that she could be capable of being a dangerous opponent for Holmes, even if she ends up being a match, but not an enemy of his. There's a moment in the opening scene where she is horrified by the damage the burglars do to a painting of her. She is clearly not a heartless femme fatale, and as we find out later, she hoped that she was wrong about Holmes's deception as the clergyman, as she felt so fondly towards the apparent kindly old gent. Yet she remains resolute in acting to protect herself, with her finely tuned survival instincts. Her opponent, the King of Bohemia, remains a boorish, self-important idiot throughout the story, caught up in his own hype. Not just expecting the worst from Adler, but unable to comprehend that he is not still the centre of her world. Wolf Kahler does a superb job in this role, himself in his mid-40s, and yet claiming to be only 30 to Holmes and Watson, who don't believe it for a second. And yet it almost seems as if the king does believe he's younger than he must know he is. He has some really interesting line readings that are almost too much, but just manage to fit the egotistical bombast of a man used to being surrounded by yes-men.
During a lengthy visit to Warsaw, I made the acquaintance of the well-known adventuress, Irene Adler.
By contrast, Holmes is much changed by the end of the story. In the beginning, he holds facts and logic, and his towering intellect, in the highest regard, following his finely honed methods to reason out the best strategy. As the story goes on, he learns that some of his conclusions are wrong. Adler isn't the cunning, heartless blackmailer he's been led to believe she is. She's a woman who has fallen in love for the second time, and it would appear that despite her hesitation, caused by her bad experience with the king, she truly is just someone who wants to be happy with her new man. Holmes learns this firsthand when he witnesses her marriage, and how genuinely kind she is when she has no reason to be. By the end of the episode, he has also realised that not only is she genuine, but she is also much cleverer than he thought, and far too clever to have been a fitting match for the oafish king. Brett is fantastic at playing the range of emotions and moods Holmes goes through in this episode, while always remaining true to the character. We never believe his Holmes has fallen completely in love with Adler, but he is able to show us how Holmes has fallen in love with the idea of Adler. There's no sexual tension between the two because she doesn't use sex as a weapon and he's in love with her fiancé, while his only love is problem solving. He plays Holmes as such a complex character with the melancholy and mania the character has, as well as being incredibly likeable and almost childlike in exuberance. David Burke's Watson plays the perfect foil to Brett's Holmes.
Well, then I am your man.
Splendid.
Both men are a little older than they perhaps should be, but right for the series, which is set at a fixed point rather than aging with the characters as the original stories do. Watson never has too much to do in adaptations, as they normally do without any narration at all, which is his primary role in the stories, but he is able to add colour to the character by showing he's no fool when it comes to a certain level of deduction.
It's a man's writing.
Good.
Presumably well-to-do.
It's expensive paper, this. It's peculiarly strong and stiff.
And yet is more willing to show his own lighter side much more regularly and more obviously than Holmes. He's also completely trusting of Holmes, despite being acutely aware that Holmes doesn't really need him. It's interesting that Watson is kept apart from Adler while Holmes interacts with her, perhaps because Watson has a far better understanding of women and may well have helped Sherlock solve the case long before he does. The episode itself looks great, far better than the television budget would suggest, although this does mean tighter shots than you might get from a film. Every inch of the frame contains a rich depth that clearly shows people who care about what they're doing. There's some great little details like Adler riding side saddle and the fake fight being started over a labour dispute that really make you feel as if you're in the time it's set. All this is aided by the sets, makeup, costumes and props. The only place this is let down is on the final shots of Adler aboard a ship, which we never see much of and feels a lot like a set rather than an actual ship. My only other criticism is that some of the opening dialogue between Holmes and Watson is a little too clunky and obviously expository. It feels like this could have either been delivered via Watson's voiceover or by putting it in the initial meeting with the king, as they are telling each other things that they both should already know. Other than that, this is a mesmerising adaptation of one of Doyle's best stories. It might not be his best or most intriguing mystery story, but it is an impeccable character study. It's such a strong start to this series. Thank you. Goodbye.